where Burkina Faso State President Ibrahim Traoré entered the Oval Office of the White House at exactly 2:30 p.m. The 15 minutes allocated to him was sufficient for a standard courtesy meeting, however, as he passed through security. He carried a golden USB drive that no one had noticed inside were documents showing the true value of natural resources extracted from Africa over the past 50 years and how only 3% had returned to the continent, the U.S. President's face turned pale when he saw the documents. "I preferred to show you these figures before making them public," said Traoré, calmly ranged them steadily against the bulletproof windows of the White House. As President Michael Harrington waited in the Oval Office, his schedule for the day included 15 diplomatic meetings, most mere formalities, photo opportunities, and handshakes to maintain America's image of engagement with developing nations. The 2:30 p.m. slot was allocated to Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who had taken control of Burkina Faso 3 years ago. "Mr. President," his chief of staff, Elaine Matthews, said, glancing at her tablet, "the Burkina Faso delegation has arrived. Should I remind you of the talking points?" Harrington nodded, straightening his tie. "Refresh my memory. Burkina Faso, that's the one with the young military guy, right? The one French intelligence has been concerned about." Matthews nodded. "Ibrahim Traoré, 36 years old, former captain who took power in a coup that was actually supported by the civilian population. He's been pursuing aggressive resource nationalization policies, particularly with gold mines, previously operated by Western companies." "Ah, yes," Harrington said, recalling the briefing papers he'd skimmed earlier. "The one causing headaches for our corporate interests. Well, let's get this over with. 15 minutes of diplomatic pleasantries, some vague promises of development aid, and we move on to the Japanese trade delegation." Matthews hesitated. "Sir, there's something else CIA has flagged at. Traoré requested this meeting personally through unusual channels. They believe he may have an agenda beyond the standard diplomatic exchange." Harrington waved dismissively. "They all have agendas, Elaine. That's politics. Send him in." The heavy doors to the Oval Office opened, and Ibrahim Traoré entered alone. No entourage, no advisors, no translators. The young African leader wore a simple military uniform without ostentation or excessive medals. His posture was straight, his gaze direct. There was something in his calm confidence that immediately made Harrington straighten in his chair. "President Traoré," Harrington said, rising to greet his visitor with practiced cordiality, "welcome to the White House." Traoré shook his hand firmly. "President Harrington, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I understand your schedule is demanding, so I appreciate these 15 minutes. Please have a seat." Harrington gestured to the chairs arranged for visitors. "How are you finding Washington? I understand this is your first visit to the United States." "It is indeed," Traoré said, settling into the chair while maintaining perfect posture, "though I must say what has impressed me most is not the monuments or the architecture, but the contrast." "Contrast?" Harrington asked, following the usual script of diplomatic small talk. "Yes." Traoré nodded. "The contrast between the wealth displayed in your capital and the purpose of that wealth. It mirrors in many ways the relationship between our continents." Harrington's diplomatic smile tightened slightly. This wasn't the direction he had anticipated for their brief exchange. "I hope you're enjoying your stay regardless. We have a long history of supporting African nations through development programs and humanitarian aid." Traoré's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. President, I appreciate the courtesy, but I requested this meeting for a specific reason, and we have limited time." Without waiting for a response, he reached into his breast pocket and removed what appeared to be a golden USB drive. The security screening had missed it, as it contained no electronic components. It was merely a shell, a symbolic vessel. "Do you know what this is?" Traoré asked, placing the golden object on the table between them. Harrington glanced at it, then at the door where his security detail waited outside. "I assume you're about to tell me this is made from the first gold processed by our national mining company after we reclaimed our mines from foreign corporations. Inside is a comprehensive report that my team has spent our years compiling." Traoré opened the USB drive, revealing it to be a cleverly designed case containing a miniature data card. He inserted it into a slim tablet he produced from another pocket and slid it across to Harrington. "What am I looking at here?" Harrington asked, studying the screen now displaying complex charts and figures, the truth about Africa's wealth. "Intro said simply this: report documents with precise figures the total value of natural resources extracted from the African continent over the past 50 years. Gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, uranium, lithium, resources that power the modern world and create immense wealth." The screen changed as Traoré swiped, showing new graphs. "And this," he continued, "shows how much of that wealth returned to Africa in any form, through taxes, royalties, local employment, infrastructure, development, or actual profit sharing. 3%, Mr. President, for every $100 of value extracted from our continent, only $3 returns to benefit our people. Harrington's diplomatic facade began to crack. These figures seem rather selective in their presentation. Our corporations create jobs, build infrastructure with respect, Mr. President, Traoré interrupted. Gently, the report accounts for all of that. The methodology is detailed in the appendix. It was developed by a team of economists from Harvard, Oxford, and the University of Cape Town. The conclusion remains 97% of Africa's resource wealth flows outward, enriching foreign shareholders and governments, Harrington cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I appreciate your passion for your country's economic sovereignty, President Traoré, but I'm not sure what you expect the United States to do about historical economic arrangements. Traoré leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to discuss history, Mr. President. I'm here to discuss the future. He swiped to another screen on the tablet. This is phase 2 of our report, a comprehensive economic analysis of what would happen if all African nations simultaneously renegotiated their resource contracts, or following Burkina Faso's example, nationalized their natural resources. The screen now displayed global economic projections, stock market impacts, and supply chain disruptions. The numbers were staggering. The global technology sector would lose access to 76% of rare earth minerals, necessary for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. The jewelry industry would face an 82% reduction in diamond supply. The global banking system would experience gold shortage that would destabilize currency markets worldwide. Harrington's face had indeed turned pale as he recognized the implications. This sounds like a threat, President Trump. Not at all. True, said calmly. It's simply economic reality. For too long, the conversation has been framed as if Africa needs the West more than the West needs Africa. These figures demonstrate the opposite is true. Your economies, your technologies, your very way of life depends on continued access to our resources. Harrington's political instincts kicked in, and I suppose you've come to offer an alternative to this economic catastrophe you're describing. Yes, Traoré nodded, swiping to a final document on the tablet. A new framework for resource partnership. We're calling it the Sankara Accord, after Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, who was assassinated in 1987 for similar ideas. The document outlined a completely restructured approach to resource extraction and profit sharing, one that would leave controlling interests in African hands, while still allowing for Western technical expertise and investment, but with dramatically different economic terms. This isn't just Burkina Faso's proposal, Traoré explained. I've spent the past year in quiet diplomacy with leaders from 23 African nations. All of them have reviewed this framework and agreed in principle to its terms. Together, we control over 90% of the critical resources your economy depends on. Harrington studied the African leader with new eyes, suddenly recognizing that he had severely underestimated both the man and the situation. What he had dismissed as a routine diplomatic courtesy was revealing itself as one of the most significant geopolitical challenges his administration had faced. Why come to me directly with this? Harrington asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Why not present this through normal diplomatic channels, or announce it at the UN? Traoré's expression softened slightly, showing the first real emotion since he'd entered the room. Because history has taught us what happens to African leaders who challenge Western economic interests too publicly before securing allies, they tend to meet unfortunate ends, or their countries experience sudden democratic uprisings or security concerns that require foreign intervention. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I came to you directly, Mr. President, because the United States has a choice to make. You can be the first Western power to embrace this new economic reality and help lead an orderly transition to a more equitable global resource economy, or you can resist and find yourself facing a united African resource coalition that will dictate terms from a position of strength. The Oval Office fell silent, except for the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Harrington's mind raced through the implications, the political calculations, the economic impacts, the historical significance of this moment. You've given me a lot to consider, President Trot, he finally said. But you must understand I can't make unilateral decisions of this magnitude in a 15-minute meeting. Traoré stood, indicating he was respecting the allocated time. I understand completely, Mr. President. The full report and proposal are now on your tablet. I've also sent copies to selected members of Congress, major news organizations, and influential economic think tanks. He smiled for the first time. They're scheduled to receive them exactly 24 hours from now, giving you time to review the material and consider your response. Harrington also rose a mix of irritation and reluctant respect on His face, that's quite a power play. President Traoré, not a power play, Mr. President. A balancing of power that is long overdue. Traoré extended his hand. I look forward to continuing this conversation. The future of our countries could be so much brighter if built on genuine partnership rather than exploitation. As they shook hands, Harrington couldn't help but ask one final question. The security screening should have detected any electronic devices. How did you get that tablet and data card into... The Oval Office Trey's smile widened slightly. Mr. President, when your country has been systematically exploited for generations, you learn to be creative with that. Cryptic response. He turned and walked toward the door. President Traoré Harrington called after him. What if we don't agree to these terms? What if we choose to resist this coalition you're forming? Traoré paused at the doorway. 3 months ago, Burkina Faso nationalized its gold mines against enormous international pressure today. Those mines are producing more gold than ever managed by our own engineers, benefiting our own people. The predicted economic collapse never materialized. His voice remained calm, but carried throughout the room. Africa doesn't need permission to claim what rightfully belongs to it. We're merely offering a path that benefits us all. With that, he was gone, leaving behind a tablet containing information that could reshape the global economic order. The 15-minute courtesy meeting had turned into one of the most consequential diplomatic encounters in recent history. As the door closed, Harrington sank back into his chair, staring at the tablet. He pressed the intercom. Elaine, get me the Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, and National Security Advisor immediately, and clear my schedule for the rest of the day outside the White House. Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the waiting car where his trusted advisor, Fatima Zongo, waited. How did it go? She asked anxiously. Exactly as we anticipated, Traoré replied, looking back at the White House through the rain-streaked window. He was shocked, then defensive, then calculating. Now comes the true test. Will they choose partnership or confrontation? And if it's confrontation, Zongo asked, concern evident in her voice. Traoré's expression remained resolute. Then we are prepared. The documents have already been distributed to key allies, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me. The African Resource Coalition will proceed. With or without American cooperation, he turned to her with determination in his eyes. The days of taking Africa's wealth while leaving its people in poverty are over. As their car pulled away from the White House, the news of Traoré's unprecedented meeting was already beginning to spread through diplomatic channels in capitals across Africa. Leaders waited anxiously for word from Washington and European financial centers. Analysts who had caught wind of the meeting were frantically trying to understand its implications. The 15 minutes in the White House had set in motion events that would reshape global power dynamics for generations to come. The world's economic future now hinged on how the United States would respond to an ultimatum, delivered not with weapons or threats, but with nothing more than economic truth and united African resolve. 24 hours later, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his hotel suite, watching international news channels with his team. The world's financial markets were in turmoil as rumors of the African Resource Coalition and its demands began to leak. Major mining companies saw their stocks plummet as investors feared nationalization across the continent. Emergency meetings were being called in Brussels, London, Beijing, and Moscow. The phone rang. It was the White House President Traoré. Harrington's voice came through clearly. I've reviewed your proposal with my advisors. Need to talk. Not for 15 minutes this time. I'm sending my presidential plane to bring you back to Camp David for proper negotiations. Traoré exchanged glances with his team before responding. That's a generous offer, Mr. President, but I think it would be more appropriate if we met on neutral ground, perhaps at the United Nations in New York, with representatives from all interested parties present. There was a pause on the line. You drive a hard bargain, President Traoré. Not a bargain, Mr. President. A new beginning, equal footing, transparent terms, mutual respect. Another pause. Very well, the UN. It is my staff will coordinate with yours for the details. As the call ended, Traoré's team erupted in cautious celebration. Centuries of economic exploitation were being challenged, and for once, Africa held the stronger position. Fatima Zongo approached Traoré with tears in her eyes. Thomas would be proud, she said, referring to Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, whose dreams had been cut short by assassination. Traoré nodded solemnly. This is just the beginning. The real work lies ahead, building an Africa that manages its own resources, develops its own industries, and determines its own future. The United Nations headquarters in New York buzzed with unprecedented activity. Security was heightened as delegations from around the world converged for what many were already calling the most significant economic summit of the century. At the center of it all was Ibrahim Traoré, who had transformed from an obscure African military leader to a global figure in a matter of days inside the main conference. Room representatives from 23 African nations sat on one side of the massive circular table across from them. Delegations from the United States, European Union, China, Russia, and other major economic powers waited with tense anticipation. President Harrington entered last, accompanied by his economic advisors. He nodded respectfully to Trump before taking his seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," began the UN Secretary General, "we are gathered here to discuss a proposal that could fundamentally reshape the global economic order. President Traoré, as the initiator of this summit, I invite you to present the Sankara Accord to the assembled nations." Traoré rose from his seat, the weight of a continent's hopes on his shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished leaders. I stand before you not just as the President of Burkina Faso, but as a representative of a unified African vision." Large screens around the room displayed the key points of the Sankara Accord, as Traoré outlined. Its framework: first, all existing resource extraction contracts will be renegotiated to ensure that a minimum of 60% of profits remain within the country of origin. Second, processing facilities must be established within African nations, ensuring that value-added industries develop on our continent rather than exporting raw materials. Third, technology transfer becomes mandatory for all foreign corporations operating in resource extraction. Fourth, environmental standards will be strictly enforced with penalties that cannot be written off as business expenses. Fifth, a portion of all resource revenues will be directed to a Pan-African Development Fund, creating infrastructure that benefits the entire continent. The room remained silent as Tro continued. "This is not a demand for charity or aid. This is a recognition of economic reality and historical injustice. The resources beneath African soil belong to African people. We are willing to share them with the world, but no longer at the expense of our own development." What followed was 3 days of intense negotiations, heated debates, threats of withdrawal, and moments of breakthrough behind closed doors. Corporate lobbyists pressured their governments to resist, while financial analysts warned of the catastrophic consequences of failure on the final day. President Harrington requested a private meeting with Traoré. "You've managed what many thought impossible," Harrington admitted, as they sat across from each other in a secure room. "You've united Africa behind a single economic vision and forced the world to listen." Traoré nodded. "It wasn't me, Mr. President. It was the undeniable logic of our position. Africa has been patient, but that patience has limits. I've been authorized to accept the core principles of the Sankara Accord," Harrington said, "with certain modifications regarding implementation timelines and specific percentage thresholds. The United States is prepared to be the first signatory, provided these adjustments are accepted." Trump considered this carefully. "The principles remain non-negotiable, but we understand the need for realistic transition periods. Show me your proposed modifications by evening." Word spread through the UN complex. An agreement had been reached. The modified Sankara Accord would be implemented over a 5-year transition period, with immediate changes to profit-sharing arrangements and gradual implementation of the more complex structural reforms. At the signing ceremony, True stood at the podium. Cameras from around the world broadcasting the historic moment. "Today marks not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in global economic relations," he said. "For centuries, Africa has been the provider of wealth for others, while its own people remained impoverished. Today, we correct that historical imbalance, not through conflict, but through mutual recognition of interdependence." He looked directly into the cameras, knowing his words would reach millions across Africa and beyond. "To the young people of Africa, I say this: